Okay, fantastic. Thank you all for joining. I will focus on implementing operating processes to accelerate development and ultimately improve probability of success in emerging biopharma. So just a quick disclaimer. As mentioned, I am a full-time employee of Cerevel Therapeutics. I am also a former employee of Pfizer. I do not own any shares. As you may have read publicly, Cerevel acquired Pfizer's previous neuroscience portfolio. So just wanted to, of course, mention that. Essentially, there's critical unmet need in terms of the area of neuroscience. Cerevel is primarily focused on neuroscience from a therapeutic perspective, and really we're looking at the next wave of innovation from a biotech perspective. We have from a neuroscience perspective, there is a significant unmet need. It is the second leading cause of deaths worldwide, and we are leading the cause of this disability globally from a therapeutic perspective. Cerevel as a company has a broad portfolio of neuroscience assets. Our goal is to develop a deep understanding of neurocircuitry while we uniquely address this opportunity. Just from an overview perspective, we have a deep pipeline of 11 assets. We have 5 assets in the clinic focused on Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, anxiety, and schizophrenia, in addition to Alzheimer's disease, apathy, and substance use disorder. We have 4 preclinical assets and 2 assets that are undisclosed that are in the pipeline, but very robust for a startup and typically not the norm. This portfolio itself represents the acquisition of Pfizer Neuroscience's previous portfolio, and we're quite busy with 8 trials. We have 3 in phase 3, 2 in phase 2, 2 in phase 1B, 1 phase 1 trial, and then 2 open label extension. We are focused on transforming the possibilities for tomorrow. There are multiple programs aimed at providing new options for millions of patients, again, focused in the neuroscience area. In terms of nearer term focus, as I mentioned, we are invested in Parkinson's, epilepsy, and schizophrenia. We are looking to expand into other disease areas such as Alzheimer's psychosis, anxiety, apathy, and substance use disorder. And we are looking at longer term investment in discovery efforts in terms of disease modifying therapies based on human genetics and novel targets, focusing on neuronal loss and synaptic health. So as I mentioned in my previous slide, there are 50+ million patients worldwide across these suffering across these various disease areas within neuroscience, and we're aiming to be that premier neuroscience company. So shifting over to the key topic in terms of accelerating the clinical trials process in emerging biopharma, I wanted to separate this into 3 distinct buckets: the challenge, the opportunity, and ultimately how to implement. The challenge that most of us face is really the identification of methodologies to reduce our timelines operationally while conserving cash flow for clinical trial execution. This is a common problem in emerging biopharma, most often companies that just have a few assets under development. The opportunity here is to develop and implement a collaborative operating environment scaled to organizational size while focusing on minimizing redundant infrastructure and preservation of capital. Lastly, from an implementation perspective, having a synergistic and flexible infrastructure between the sponsor, the emerging biopharma company, the CRO, academic investigator, and vendor partners as clinical trial needs adapt over time relative to organization. So leveraging startup as a secret weapon for success, most of us know that it takes approximately 6 to 8 months from initial site identification to study startup completion. Roughly 30% of the total study budget is invested to facilitate and begin enrollment of a study. So this is a significant spend, especially for an emerging biopharma organization, as well as a significant investment from a time perspective, especially with organizations with limited capital focused on preservation of that cash flow. I wanted to illustrate some factors impacting startups, so things like study design, contracting and budget negotiations, recruitment, enrollment, and retention assumptions, as well as newer therapeutic areas. So as therapeutic areas expand and progress, we are developing new relationships with CROs, with new sites, investigators, and new vendors. In terms of implementing risk mitigation strategies, these are strategies to prospectively enable that successful startup. So having optionality around study procedures when protocols are developed in regards to the remote visits optionality, procedures that may be nice to have but not required, etc. In addition to sponsor-directed communications, we've all heard that sites and investigators and vendors, CROs, like being contacted directly, and having that relationship directly with the sponsor can certainly help facilitate startup activities. Also focused on a quality checklist development, so authoring a checklist focused on quality and prospectively identifying areas for which there may be challenges related to the quality of the study in terms of its life cycle, both from a startup conduct and closeout perspective. And then lastly, a proactive instead of reactive approach in terms of what that risk mitigation strategy looks like in regards to enabling successful startup while maintaining that timeline and financial investment. So what does that look like? In regards to developing the right operational identity, particularly in an emerging biopharma, it really is surrounding and building that collaborative operating environment. From a regulatory and business requirement perspective, it's facilitating that engagement of long and short-term key external partners in development and optimization activities. It's identification of the right partners, development of criteria for selection based on viability as a function of experience. So this could be through certifications, through location of the partners, their respective financial status, compliance record as it relates to developing that quality document, etc. Additionally, scalability. So as the biopharma organization grows, as the startup company progresses, you want to accommodate that growth without impacting execution performance of your clinical trial. And as I mentioned, mitigation of risk via limiting of different technologies, applications, and processes, which contribute to delays from an efficiency perspective. And then lastly, that trial design piece to optimize execution. As I mentioned on the previous slide, prospectively allowing that flexibility, both from a clinical trial design and execution perspective. We've seen a lot of adaptive approaches to clinical trial design, and to consider implementing those into your protocols in order to allow for that flexibility and optimization. And then lastly, increasing the odds of success to reduce external investments to inform those go, no-go decisions quickly, especially for emerging biopharma organizations with a small number of assets that you really need to pivot to inform those go, no-go decisions more quickly as it relates to development of your CDPs and ultimately investment in the assets going forward. Lastly, I just wanted to cover that the key theme in terms of flexibility in regards to avoiding trial delays. Some of the key big buckets are adaptation of digital and technology enablement, anything that can be automated in terms of highly repetitive processes and generation of new insights and data. So essentially, from a small biopharma perspective, sharing that investment with CROs and vendors, most notably for technology that is perhaps emerging and where there cannot be a significant financial investment. However, implementation of digital and various digital and technological investments would be key. There may be an opportunity for partnership in terms of sharing that financial investment, most notably for opportunities that may not be fully validated or fully scalable. In addition, including critical elements without insisting on perfection to accelerate development of those key deliverables and maximizing outcomes, really based on early input from internal and external stakeholders. So, enabling a cultural shift to decisions based on the minimum viable deliverable in order to facilitate progression of sticking to the study timeline and ultimately avoiding trial delays. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight that data, risk, external and competitive environments should also inform clinical trial execution and planning, in addition to implementation to facilitate timely readouts. So essentially, there is a no one-size-fits-all approach here, and that dynamic flexibility is certainly key. So with that, I'll stop there. I appreciate the opportunity to present and hope that I was able to share some key parameters for emerging biopharma in terms of accelerating what that clinical trial process looks like, both from a timeline and financial investment perspective. So thank you for the opportunity and welcome to questions.
Thank you, Stacey. That was a very good presentation, and thanks to everybody for being flexible with the technology. I think, one of the keys to survival is to be adaptable, and appreciate everybody being adaptable and making it happen. I think it worked out quite well, all things considered. We're ready now for some questions and answers. So anybody in the audience that has questions, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And if you just hit that button, then you'll be able to ask some questions. And while we are getting those questions, Stacey, what are your long-term objectives as a company? Are you looking to be a fully integrated pharmaceutical company with sales and marketing? Or are you looking for partners in order to help advance to the market? Can you share any insights on that?
We are a very young company. We are about a year and a half old. Throughout that past year, we've really been focused on that scalability piece, as I mentioned in my talk. For a startup, we are quite a dynamic anomaly in the sense that we have, as I mentioned, 11 assets. So really we're focused on growth, both from an internal perspective as well as opportunities for integrating various partnership models with CROs, vendors, etc. Organizationally, we are still very much in that evolutionary growth mode. I presume as our organization matures and we are facilitating the execution of our trials, that will yield hopefully some successful sets of data that we'll certainly have a vision in terms of where our organization hopes to be from an emerging biopharma perspective to a larger organization, and potentially further opportunities for expansion in the future. So it's still very much in growth mode.
Okay, thank you for that. So we do have some questions from the audience. You can take a look yourself, or I'll be happy to read the question for you. Do you have access to the questions, Stacey?
I do. Thank you, John.
Okay.
I see the first one is focused on adaptive trial design, and it's great, but needs careful consideration on how randomization works, as misrandomization is a real risk. That's absolutely true, and that's just one example. That is certainly not a one-size-fits-all. It certainly also depends on the therapeutic area and patient population under consideration. I do see another question focused on early adoption of technologies. In terms of tools we believe that are important for small startups to get into earlier rather than later, I would say anything that can be adopted from a virtual perspective is always key. It's important to understand the parameters of what that looks like. So when we think about things like eCOA platforms and eConsent and things that can kind of facilitate execution of the trials a bit easier within limited infrastructure have certainly been successful for us. I would also highlight the emerging digital technologies are opportunistic from a piloting perspective. So potential partnerships with small and large companies in terms of what these emerging technologies look like, and the potential opportunity to integrate them as exploratory measures in trials certainly helps with validation processes as well. So it can be essentially a shared investment between the sponsor and the company looking to pilot the technology. And I see, John, that the questions are here and coming through in real time, but some of them are disappearing quite quickly. So if there's another question, I'm happy to answer.
Yep, so we do have one from Harumi Tada. He's asking, what are your thoughts about the efficiencies of platform trials in specific indications such as trials like ISPY2, Precision Promise, GBM Agile, BAML? These tend to be sponsored by nonprofits, but pharma and CROs can also set up similar trials to sponsor them. What do you think about CROs setting up platform trials? And that's from the Chief Medical Officer of Notable Labs, Dr. Harumi Tada.
Thank you, Harumi. I appreciate that. I think that it's very much an evolving process as well. I'll go back to the dynamic theme. Certainly from a Cerevel perspective, we have not been involved with CROs setting up these types of platform trials and specific indications. I think there's certainly an opportunity here for optimization. Interesting that they are sponsored by nonprofits, but pharma and CROs also have that opportunity from a setup perspective, and I think that that's certainly something we'll consider going forward. And I do see another question from Farah for Cerevel as a growing emerging pharma with many studies ongoing, that what challenges do we face in terms of managing the administrative elements of clinical trials? I think from our perspective, it's timely onboarding of key partners for selection. So in regards to CRO selection, vendor selection, selecting the right sites, those are mainly our key challenges from a startup perspective, as they do set precedents for execution of the trial. So it's really the right fit for the right study. For example, one study in a healthy volunteer population may require a phase 1 unit, and we are aware of of CROs and vendors that can facilitate executions of those types of studies. But some of the other challenges we're faced with are more dynamic trial models, which require both in and outpatient capabilities. So, finding those right partners and developing that infrastructure prospectively to meet the needs of that particular study design is certainly something that we're focused on, especially provided the various aspects and disease areas that our dynamic portfolio is focused on.
Okay, well, that's great, Stacey. I hope you can hear the virtual applause from the audience. And thank you very much for your presentation.